Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is not Brent Hayden. I'm just rolling solo today. 6 games, a pretty good 6 game slate. A couple of teams on back-to-backs here, which is a little bit worrisome. We do still have a hefty injury report to kind of touch on with some new names to mention, but a couple guys coming back that's going to definitely change things. We're going to jump into this Boston-Orlando game first. Boston's still favored by 6.5. 203 over under here. Part of that is obviously because Orlando is just such a hit and miss team. Boston obviously dealing with the injuries can always put up a dud. Obviously, we saw them come out to play against Washington. Should have, probably won that game, put that game away twice, but didn't. Expect Boston to play well here tonight. They're going to get Al Horford back, which that does change things just a little bit. The backcourt is still going to be, majority of the time it is going to be, Nader playing the two. We're going to see some Shane Larkin in there. Terry Rozier is obviously a guy who's been priced up across the industry, especially after dropping 50 fantasy points in that double overtime game. But still don't mind, obviously, Rozier here, 27.2% usage rate, even with Horford on the court. 1.14 fantasy points per minute. We're looking at an Orlando team that ranks 24th in defensive efficiency over the last 10 games, also allowing those opposing point guards to shoot 48% from the field in that span. I like Rozier here in the spot, even at a heightened price tag. Maybe people will be off, but I still like the upside here, still like the usage. You can still look at like a guy like Shane Larkin. I didn't see anything about a minutes limit last time out, but he still played, 24 minutes in that game against Washington. Didn't play into the overtime just because he was on a limit. So kind of expect 24 or 27 minutes here. He's still basically at a punt price. He put up 23 fantasy points. Probably has a little bit higher upside if he can get a few extra minutes, especially in this matchup. It is a much better matchup than the Washington game was. So like Larkin here. If you're looking anywhere else, obviously you can look at Jason Tatum. Usage rate still 31%, even with Horford on the court, 0.95 fantasy points per minute. Good spot against a bad Orlando defense. And then we're kind of looking at some of the front court guys. I mean, Marcus Morris played exceptionally well. We knew he was going to pick up the offensive slack. Price is still fairly decent on him. It is a good matchup against Orlando. They struggle on the glass, 18th in defensive efficiency against power forwards as well. Morris sees a sizable usage, 28.2% usage rate, 1.06 fantasy points per minute. That's even with Horford on, so obviously very much playable. Greg Monroe should still get some run. I could see him playing a little bit of the 4. Could see playing a little bit of 5 with Horford going to the 4. They're likely going to mix and match both those guys. Greg Monroe is still fairly cheap. You can look at him, still kind of anticipate about 20, 25 minutes for him tonight in this spot. Obviously going to be a guy who's going to be relied on for offense moving forward. So Monroe is a cheaper option, but I'm really looking at Horford here in this spot. Small sample size, but 30.4% usage rate without all these names off the court this season, 1.26 fantasy points per minute. As mentioned, they rank 18th against power forwards the last 10 days, 19th against opposing centers. I like the upside for right around 7K on both sites. Horford is definitely a fine option you can get some exposure to. Orlando side of things, we're still going to have to wait on the Aaron Gordon news. He still needs to clear his concussion test. If that's the case, likely going to see him in the lineup. Potential minutes limit, maybe, just because Orlando needs to tend to be kind of cautious with Gordon going on another concussion. But if he sits, once again, we can fire up the, Jonathan Simmons, who's coming off just a monster game, put up 35 real points, shot 50% from the field. I like him in this spot. Obviously, we know the usage rate is going to be there. We look at Boston, 28th in defensive efficiency against small forwards the last 10 games, so he's very much playable. I won't be expecting the huge DJ Augustine game where he just, frankly, could not miss. While Boston obviously is going to struggle defensively moving forward, you can take shots with some of these guys. I don't mind DJ Augustine here. Decent cash game play. I'm not really expecting the big upside game, but I guess if he kind of fits your radar in tournaments, you can take a look, but I'm going to be going other ways. We've seen Boston slip to 15th in defensive efficiency against point guards over the last 10 games. So, that number is likely going to continue to decline while these guys are out, especially Marcus Smart. It's definitely a huge loss for that backcourt defense. So Augustine in play. Evan Fournier is working his way back, but I still think he sits out another day here. Jonathan Isaac obviously likely will fill in, play around 25 minutes for Gordon. I don't have a ton of interest on this one. I still think Simmons is a guy who's owned is obviously going to be a guy who will get some run as well. But Vucevic finally saw a pretty good upside game out of him. Has averaged 39 fantasy points in 2 meetings against Boston while averaging just 26 minutes per game. If he gets the big minutes here, which he should, this is a very solid spot. Boston 23rd defensive efficiency against centers. Vucevic very intriguing on this slate, like the upside with Gordon out. If Gordon plays, it downgrades the usage a little bit here for Vucevic, and I might be going some other directions, but definitely in play in this spot. So outside of that, not really looking at a ton of the other options here. That's about it for that Orlando side. Brooklyn, Philly next here, 217 total. Philly favored by 8.5. Philly on a back-to-back, but let's talk Brooklyn here first. Like D'Angelo Russell, he's averaged 29 fantasy points over his last 5 games. Minutes right around that 28 to 30 mark. I still like the upside for under 7K in this spot, so he is playable in GPPs and cash games. This is kind of my correlation play with this Philly side, because obviously you're going to want some Philly exposure tonight. You're going to be looking at your Embiids and Simmons and Dario Saric and getting some exposure against this awful Brooklyn defense. So like going to the well with Russell to kind of counter that, keep this game close. Brooklyn tends to kind of keep these games close, so not too worried about a blowout. Outside of that, though, I mean, you can look at Rondae Hollis-Jefferson and GPPs. Obviously struggled a little bit against Philly last time out. The problem is just Philly's been really good defensively, having a ton of upside. Shooting guard's been their weaker spot, which is why I'm looking at Russell here. With Redick and Bellinelli kind of being the main shooting guards, like you're going to get a solid matchup all around. So I like going that direction. Outside of that, I mean, DeMar Carroll still finding cash games. Karis LeVert is very interesting in GPPs here, showing some solid usage off the bench, especially if Alan Crabb is out. I know he's due with an illness. That's going to free up some minutes for guys like LeVert. Going to see Joe Harris get some minutes as well, but hasn't really been appealing as far as a fantasy option. Doesn't have a ton of usage when he's out there on the floor. So definitely look at Carroll. Definitely look at LeVert as kind of secondary options. Hollis-Jefferson's a volatile GPP play, but Russell's the main guy here. Not really looking at anyone else. Not terribly intrigued with Dinwiddie in this spot, who's kind of come back down to earth and hasn't really played well against Philly this season anyway. So willing to go kind of with the other options. On the Philly side, of course, we are going to be looking at some of these big-time studs. We do need to keep an eye on Joel Embiid here. The issue is that, when we look at his injury here, he's dealing with a wrist. Played last night. Obviously, still that's something that's a little worrisome, just given that Embiid's injury history, not really with the wrist, but just because they need to be careful with the guy moving forward on a back-to-back. He's starting to play more back-to-backs going down the line. Obviously we saw the upside in back-to-back games against the Knicks and the Pacers. I like the matchup here against Brooklyn. Obviously didn't put up a great game against Brooklyn last time out because they blew them out 120 to 97, but obviously still put up 40 fantasy points in 26 minutes. If this game stays close, which I'm kind of anticipating that it will here on a back-to-back, has that upside of 45 plus fantasy points. So I like the potential here. Really like Ben Simmons tonight. Just such a great spot to a Brooklyn team that's just not good against point guard. 30th defensive efficiency. They give up a ton of fantasy points. He's averaged 40 fantasy points over the last 5 games. If Embiid obviously does sit, then obviously we're going to look at some higher exposure to guys like Simmons and Saric. But none of these guys are really dependent on Embiid sitting. They just would get a bump. Saric is another option who's been quite solid over the last 2 games. Has been really solid against Brooklyn, as you can expect, given that they have a weak, front court defense. So Saric, Simmons, and Embiid are kind of your main targets here. I don't mind going with Covington and GPPs. I still will not trust him in cash games. Has played well of late. We're starting to see the shot drop a little bit more. We see him pick up some big steal games. But I'm not diving on in cash games and then having it fall off here just because that's what Covington's been known to do. So put up 40 fantasy points against Brooklyn last time out. Still fairly cheap. He is a viable option. You can look at guys like JJ Redick and cash games. Not a big GPP guy. Decent matchup against Brooklyn. Outside of that, though, not too many appealing options. Bellinelli's still not really crossing over that 20 fantasy point mark. Ilyasova is getting some time off the bench. He did play in that blowout. He played 26 minutes. GPP, sure, but that's kind of about it for him. That's it for Philly. Dallas and Toronto. Toronto favored by 11 here at home. Dallas tanking away. Toronto just keeps on winning. I don't see this game staying close. I just saw news that JJ Barea will play here. So obviously that's going to toss in another guard. We've been kind of dealing with the injury to Wes Matthews, which has freed up minutes for obviously both him and Barea, with Farrell and Barea. I don't have a ton of interest in these guys tonight. I don't really have a ton of interest in this Dallas team. You just look at Toronto, and there's just not really a way that I'm looking to attack. Top 5 in defensive efficiency over the last 10 games. They've been really stout. You can take a look at like a Dwight Powell, just because Toronto has been a little bit vulnerable on the glass and as against other bigs, but that's kind of it. Dennis Pitt Jr., if you want to play in GPPs, fine, just given that the usage rate is still high, but there's better options than like Harrison Barnes here. It's not a good spot for him. Like Dirk, Noel, all these other guys that are getting some run at the front court, not terribly intriguing. So Dallas is a team that I'm happily just kind of maybe overlooking on tonight's slate. Toronto, I think obviously because this game is likely going to be a blowout, like I might look at some other directions. We saw Valanciunas come off a big game. This is a back-to-back for them. They were at Indiana last night. They traveled into Toronto. It's not terribly far, but we've seen Valanciunas obviously put up huge upside games. The usage rate's been through the roof over the last 2. I don't mind going here. He's an intriguing GPP option on tonight's slate. A little worried on the back-to-back. Hasn't seen a ton of drop-off. I mean, he's averaged 25 days on the second night compared to, about 27 on days of rest, 23 on 2 days rest. So not terribly worried. He is viable in GPPs. He's just a little bit too expensive for me. That's what the ownership is going to come down to, is people just saying basically Valanciunas is too expensive. Serge Ibaka is still pretty cheap. Obviously hasn't shown a ton of upside of late, but is worthy of a look. We know he has that double-double potential, has that block shot potential. Still cash game viable, kind of expect around 20 fantasy points as a floor, but does have upwards of 30 fantasy points as kind of a ceiling here in this spot. Fred VanVleet continues to be a solid option. I know he didn't play particularly well against Indiana last time out, but I like him in this spot. Could see him getting about 25 minutes here, maybe a little bit more if we get a blowout. But looking at the guards, I don't mind Kyle Lowry. Down game against Indiana last time out, didn't shoot well, hasn't shot over 40% in the last 3 games, but going up against Dallas is a spot that we really like to attack. 22nd defensive efficiency over the last 10 games. Lowry continues to be a guy who I will be looking at that price tag. He's averaging 38 fantasy points over his last 5, so still a viable option. You can look at DeRozan in this spot. Obviously, the Matthews injury is going to limit their defense a little bit. Seeing guys like Farrell and Barea and Dennis Smith, like these are all non-elite defenders by any means. So you're going to be looking at guys like DeRozan. Given that shooting guard's a little bit weak, you can look at DeRozan and cash and GPPs. But once again, the blowouts may limit their minutes a little bit here in that spot, and that's kind of concerning. As always, guys like Jakob Poeltl and Pascal Siakam are intriguing options. They are cheap. They have that potential to hit 25-plus fantasy points, especially in this matchup against Dallas. It is a pretty intriguing spot. Moving on here, Clippers and Thunder. Clippers also on a back-to-back, going up against OKC. OKC favored by just 4.5. Obviously, every game in the Western Conference has been pretty huge. It has a huge impact. Both these teams need to continue to win games. Looking at this Clippers side, pretty healthy. Obviously, Gallinari is still the only one who's out. Tobias Harris playing really well. Somewhat of a tough matchup. We've seen OKC shore up things a little bit against power forwards of late, but I'm still not terribly afraid. I like Tobias Harris in GPPs just because he is playing so well with the Clippers, and because you're probably going to be wanting to get some exposure to this game, especially if Paul George sits. Obviously, it's going to be basically just Westbrook first to Clippers, and it's going to be one hell of a game to kind of watch Westbrook try to take over. If George plays, obviously still can look at some of these guys, but obviously, we've seen the Thunder defense slip up without Roberson and without George on the floor. They could potentially hurt even more. So guys like Harris, very much in play. Lou Williams is intriguing, even though he hasn't been a huge upside guy of late. But I do like him on this slate. pretty good history against OKC. Put up 40 fantasy points and 44 fantasy points earlier this season. Has put up huge kind of shooting games against them. And given the fact that Roberson is not playing anymore this season, we've seen obviously them take a huge drop off defensively over the last 10 games. 27th defensive efficiency against shooting guards. Williams averaging 36 fantasy points per game over the last 5, despite not really shooting well. I like Williams here just because shooting guard is fairly weak. I like Lou Williams kind of squaring off with Westbrook here and going back and forth. Could see that happening. Austin Rivers, he's cash viable in this spot. It's not the greatest matchup in the world, but he's still just playing a ton of minutes and still just seeing enough usage to kind of get by. DeAndre Jordan is pretty intriguing, especially if Adams sits here. Hasn't had some bad games against OKC this year. Obviously, well, I guess the one earlier this year, he wasn't great. But last time out, 49 fantasy points. He's coming off a monster game against Chicago 2 games ago. The boards are going to be there. There's going to be a ton of brick shots, obviously, coming from this Thunder team. So more than well okay with using Jordan. Probably like him a little bit more in GPPs, but pretty safe cash game as well. So you can definitely look at the big guys here. Outside of that, I don't have a ton of interest in Thornwell or Teodosic. They just don't have a ton of upside in the spot. They're kind of splitting minutes as a backcourt. I'm not terribly intrigued. You see Rivers and Williams sucking up most of the usage anyway. So that's kind of it from the Clippers side of things. OKC, Paul George questionable, Steven Adams questionable. Obviously, we'll start with Westbrook. With George off the floor this season, 45.6% usage rate, 1.68 fantasy points per minute. George is off. Westbrook becomes kind of the must play of the slate. At that price tag, now I think you can definitely pay it off, and we can see a ceiling game. Looking at a matchup against the Clippers defense, it's just not really all that appealing against opposing point guards. I'm sorry, I just look at that backcourt and have no idea who the hell would slow down Westbrook. So fire away if George sits. Even if George plays, you can get some exposure, but it obviously downgrades his usage a little bit. Also, George being out would affect Melo. We've seen his usage stay around 31% with George off the court, still averaging about 101 fantasy points per minute. If George plays, I'm a little off Melo here in this spot. I might look at some other directions, might look at some of the Heat guys, some of the Lakers as well, and Marcus Morris maybe a little bit more, but be very intriguing. Corey Brewer is still fairly cheap. You can look at him. You look at the Clippers, 23rd in defensive efficiency against shooting guards and small forwards the last 10 games. Look at Brewer averaging 24 fantasy points in 29 minutes over the last 5. Continues to be a viable option. If Adams plays, I'm still a little bit hesitant. I think there's enough centers to just kind of go out and go some other directions other than Adams. I think he's also a guy that they need to just kind of get healthy here. So I don't anticipate him playing. If he does, I don't really have any interest anyway, just given that we have Horford, we have Jordan, we have so many other options, Embiid, Valanciunas. These guys are just kind of overshadowing Adams in the spot, who I don't feel like we need to kind of take the risk on right now. Outside of that, there really isn't none of your bench guys. You can look at a Jeremy Grant. He would be an intriguing option in this spot if we get those guys sitting, and like George, Adams. If we see Adams sit, Patrick Patterson should get some run, but Jeremy Grant's the guy that I have the more interest in. Sacramento favored by 9.5, 210 over runner. Sacramento, Skal Labissiere, he's the guy who's questionable in tonight's slate. Don't see any other questionable tags for him, but as always, you need to keep an eye on, just given the fact that they can rest veterans at any time. Going to start with Willie Cauley-Stein here. His average 37 fantasy points in 2 meetings against Golden State this year. It shot 70% from the field. Definitely viable. We think Golden State them kind of, a little bit sloppy defensively at times this year, especially against opposing bigs. So Cauley-Stein is very much in play here. As far as other guys, like De'Aaron Fox doesn't have a ton of upside, but he's still a decent cash game play. He's going to play right around 30 minutes per game. Going to get you around that 25, 30 fantasy point mark at that price, which is, it's fair. If Skal sits, I have some interest in Randolph and GPPs. Well, we saw that upside against Miami last time out. We know the usage is going to be there when he's on the court. Usage rate over his last few games that he's played, it's right around 32%. So Randolph at that price, it's not a bad spot for him. You can look to go that way. Buddy Hield in GPPs is fine. We've seen basically the tail of him lately: 44, 10, 33, 9, 28, 18 over his last 6 games. That's just kind of the volatility that he brings to the table. Bogdanovich maybe a little bit safer in cash games, but he's kind of been a little bit up and down of late as well. But you can look at these guys. I mean, obviously, I kind of expect this game to stay close with no Curry or Thompson. I know Durant's questionable, probably likely going to be playing. They get Draymond Green back. So I do think this game stays close. And obviously, if you're looking at kind of a Durant or Draymond, you want those huge ceiling games out of them. You would think that the Kings stay close. So you can definitely give them a look. Outside of that, I know Kufos and Jackson are getting minutes and Mason are getting minutes, but I'm looking at some higher upside guys instead on this slate. Golden State side of things, as mentioned, Kevin Durant is questionable for tonight's game. He did go through practice yesterday. He was dealing with this rib issue against the Lakers. Did that maybe affect him a little bit? I don't know. He had some bad shots. He still obviously put up 26 fantasy points. I was expecting a little bit more. Only 45 fantasy points on that game against the Lakers, so it wasn't terribly great, but obviously has the upside here against this Kings team. I don't need to go into too much. We know the usage rate is through the roof without these guys. Even with Draymond back, 42% usage rate, 1.65 fantasy points per minute. He obviously rivals Westbrook as kind of a guy who's going to be an extreme high usage player on this slate. So Durant's intriguing. Obviously, Draymond's in play now that he's back and healthy. He's averaging 37 fantasy points over his last 5. Good matchup here against the Kings. Should be able to rack up peripheral stats. Has been over 30 fantasy points in each of the last 2 games against the Kings. You can go that way. I really don't have a ton of interest in the guards here. I know we're going to see some Quinn Cook and Sean Livingston and Nick Young and Iguodala, and all these guys are going to kind of cut in to eat into each other. Then I'm not terribly intrigued with their upside on this slate. If Durant sits for any reason, I have all the interest in the world in Omri Caspi. Was decent against the Lakers. I was expecting maybe a little bit more, but still obviously had a 24% usage rate. Durant sits, obviously, looking at Caspi as a must play on the slate, just at his price. I don't mind him. He should still get some run tonight, but I think we're kind of going to see some split workloads out of this Warriors team to kind of pick up the slack. I don't think we're going to see a huge emergence from anyone. So kind of the same thing as always with Golden State. Play their big stars. You can get some exposure to maybe the cheaper guys if you're looking for that 20, 25 fantasy point upside, but that's kind of about it. Last game of the night here, Miami and LA, 219 total. Miami dealing with some injuries. Josh Richardson is doubtful. Dwayne Wade, Hassan Whiteside ruled out. So that's obviously going to create a little bit of an issue here. We're going to see some guys pick up minutes still. We're going to see some fantasy points per minute change, especially with Richardson out. Dragic is a guy who sees a 30% usage rate, still just 1.04 fantasy points per minute. You've watched the pods the last few games where the Heats have been on the slate. Like, Dragic put up 33 real points the other night against Sacramento in an overtime game and only had 36 fantasy points. He's not rebounding well. He's not getting a ton of assists. Doesn't really have the peripheral upside as far as blocks and steals go. Yes, you can use him here. I do think he's a decent cash game option. I know he's been struggling a little bit like Washington and Portland, but probably 30, 35 fantasy points here. GPPs, sure. I'm not going to say he doesn't have upside because anyone with a 30% usage rate against the Lakers is going to have some upside to go by their name. And at that price, you really are looking for about 35, 40. It's kind of all you need out of him. But very well in play. If he can get some peripheral stats, obviously that'll be there. I do expect him to score pretty well tonight, so that's about it. Justice Winslow, he's going to be another one that you can take a look at here. He has seen or averaged 0.91 fantasy points per minute with the names out. He's averaging 31 fantasy points over his last 5 games, rebounding really well, shooting really well. I'll go back to the well on Winslow, especially with Richardson out. Wayne Ellington should pick up a ton of run if you need a cheap shooting guard option. He averages 0.75 fantasy points per minute with those names out, 20.1% usage rate. So very playable here. Front court's kind of really where I want to get to. Tyler Johnson's also a safe cash game guy. He doesn't have a ton of upside, but cash game playable before I gloss over him. But looking at the 3 power forwards, Kelly Olynyk, James Johnson, Bam Adebayo, all very, very playable here. Olynyk's averaging 30 fantasy points over his last 5 games. He's doing it various ways. Strong matchup here. has seen about a 27% usage rate and 1.16 fantasy points per minute with those names out. Adebayo's got a ton of potential. Obviously, you have to worry about getting into foul trouble. That's kind of the issue. But obviously, put up 16 boards last time out. I expect him to rebound. Block shots could also be there in that potential, but there does carry some risk. James Johnson's the guy that I'm kind of taking a look at. Should see 30-plus minutes here in an up-tempo matchup against the Lakers. Coming off a big game against the Kings, nearly triple-doubled. I love the fact that James Johnson will do some ball handling duties at times, which does help his assist total. So I really like the potential for James Johnson. That 4,700 price tag over on FanDuel is an absolute steal for tonight's slate. So definitely going to be looking to get a ton of exposure. He's in the GPP article that you can look at today. So definitely viable. This is definitely a good team, a good area where you can still get a ton of bargain. You have Olnick in about the 5Ks, Johnson 4 to 5K, and then you have Adebayo, who's still really cheap. So ton of potential to look at from this Miami side going up against the Lakers. 108 implied total. This is one of the higher scoring games on the slate. We've seen Miami not play very good defensive late, so should be pretty back and forth. They're going to have to pick up the pace a little bit going up against the Lakers on the road. So good exposure to this last game. Once again, we've been kind of picking on the Lakers games as kind of late night hammers, and that's the case with Miami. So they offer a ton of good mid-range upside plays and some cheap guys as well. Over on the Lakers side of things, still looking at Kyle Kuzma as questionable for tonight's slate. We saw what happened last time out. We saw Isaiah Thomas slide into the 2-guard, and we saw KCP play the 3. I don't really mind either one of those guys. KCP is still going to play a ton of minutes. He was kind of a downer against Golden State, but we know the potential is still there. He just didn't really shoot all that well. He's a guy who's been racking up a ton of steals, which obviously helps on both sides. KCP obviously didn't play that well last time out against Miami, but losing some of their guys is a little bit helpful on the defensive side. So you can look at him. Isaiah Thomas, he's fine. I don't know if he quite has the same upside, but scoring 20-plus real points in 3 games, 3 straight games. He did go off against Miami earlier this year. He's viable. Definitely at that price tag. Like I'm willing to go into him in cash games and even GPPs, but I think if you're looking for kind of true upside, you are going to be looking for Lonzo Ball, who's a little bit more expensive. Miami hasn't been the best defensively against point guards of late. Ball's still very intriguing in this spot. And then you look at the front court. I mean, Julius Randle obviously should have a field day. Brook Lopez could possibly have a field day. We just see the upside that teams have against Miami front courts when they are missing Whiteside. So you can go back to the well and Randle. He's averaging 40 fantasy points over his last 5 games. He has 3 straight double-doubles. Solid cash, solid GPP play. Brook Lopez, I thought he was going to fall off against Golden State. That wasn't the case. He had 5 blocks on a steal. Obviously, huge upside. Going up against Miami here, I don't mind going back to the well with Lopez. Obviously, he's in a price tag now that's pretty expensive, but definitely worth a look. So if Kuzma plays, obviously that shifts, Thomas back to the bench. He's still playable there. Still going to see a decent usage rate off the bench. Kuzma would be intriguing just because he is logging a ton of minutes, but obviously we need to keep an eye on any minutes limit whatsoever from him, just given that he's young and is going through some banged-up injuries. But very playable here. Expect this one to be a high-scoring game. Lakers favored by 4. They have 112 implied totals tonight. It's pretty damn high for the Lakers, so definitely be firing away at this last game. For me, you can head over to DaveFantasyCafe.com. GPP article up, cheat sheets are up, optimizers, everything good to go. Definitely follow DF Cafe on Twitter. You can follow myself at Jacob11. And I'll see you guys next week.